There was Eru, the one who in Arda is called Luvatar, and he made the first Ainur, the holy ones, and they were the offspring of his fort, and they were with him before aught else was made. Hello, welcome to How to Play D&D, the Explainer podcast with one experienced dungeon master and one failed scriptwriter to discuss D&D topics. My name is Kinsey, and my spectacular guest this week is Sean F. Smith, and that was the first line of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Silmarillion. Hello, Sean.
Hello, Connor. How are you?
I'm good. After having a panic attack attempting to read that, I'm pretty sure I must have got one word wrong or a pronunciation completely incorrect. I will be doing that consistently throughout the episode, just to save face.
I think it's important to kind of get the capacity out there first.
Consistency is key, even if it's wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The whole of the story is very much built up in the oral tradition anyway, and so it's meant to be. It was recounted first, and it's translated from 2 or 3 different made-up languages. So you can claim it's a historicist point that you're making if someone claims you're mispronouncing something. My old English teacher at university refused to pronounce Don Quixote in the Spanish way, and would always call it Don Quixote. And she was such a terrifying woman that no one could really correct her, because she was like, yes, I know most people don't do this, but I do, so get used to it.
Do you know what? That really reminds me of my mum, who refuses to not say jalapenos. And it's exactly the same. Scary. She knows what she's doing. I'm not gonna challenge it.
Yeah, no.
There we go.
Important.
It is. So this week's episode is a deep dive into the Lord of the Rings. A short deep dive because it'll be around an hour, but I'm really excited to do this episode. I know you're excited to do this episode because you put your name down for it, and I was like, this is the perfect person. Someone with dry sense of humour, wit, charisma, oozing a sexuality I've never experienced. And then, more importantly, understanding the words that I won't. So
that does help. I do have a formal training in English, specifically medieval English as well, actually. So
okay.
For the purposes of this, the Tolkien chair in Oxford is the head medievalist there, and I wasn't trained by that chair, but rather by a human, and also not in Oxford. So.
Oh, I see. And are they the person who won't spell Don Quixote or pronounce Don Quixote correctly?
No, that was... Well, to be fair, so that was Professor Bella Millett. She was doing the Old English. She taught me Beowulf, but the Middle English stuff, that was John McGavin, a man who we once described as a walrus of knowledge. He was a glorious man. He still is, as far as I'm aware. I've just... obituary him.
I hope so. It's like he'll be more famous if he's already dead. So we're respecting him before it happens. So okay,
exactly.
Well, let's get to it. So today's episode is on the Lord of the Rings, a deep dive into a world so fleshed out we could only contain it into one episode. We are here to discuss how D&D is inspired by it and how the Lord of the Rings is a fantastic reference when building your own world and story. Sean, am I right in thinking Gandalf is a Wilf? What am I doing?
I do think so, because there's certainly the whole sense of were it not for his wizardry, it would not be possible to have such powerful carnal feelings towards him.
I agree. And, when you think he can't keep coming back, that really sexy ex, even if he's dead, he somehow manages to get the text through, and you go crawling back when he becomes Gandalf the White, and that's he's inescapable.
It's always that I've changed, I've come back.
Yeah.
It's like no, all those things that you didn't want. It's. Sometimes you've just got to scratch that itch, and
he's scratching it.
He is.
He's powerful.
I've seen his staff actually
in London in the pub.
not whilst it was live in the pub, but yes, no. For the people who don't know, Gandalf does have a pub in London, but no, it was on display in the British Library at one point, and so you could come and see up close
Amazing.
the wizard staff with the knob on the end.
Yeah, nice. That's very cool. Yeah, I've been to the pub, I saw the staff, saw the memorabilia, was praying he would come in, and that's not why I was there. Someone actually took me there as a look around London, even though I live 40 minutes from London. So it wasn't like I was a tourist, like traveling the world. But there we go. It's fine. Um, okay then. So can you give us a brief premise to the story itself of Lord of the Rings? And by that, I guess it could be The Hobbit, the Silmarillion, that the whole kind of like concept as to
Mm,
why the Lord of the Rings is so big.
mm. So in its most basic form, the Lord of the Rings is essentially a story about a piece of magical jewelry. Um, and the focal point of the titular Lord of the Rings being the like 6 books slash 3 films slash 3 extended films. That is pretty much entirely focuses on the ring of the title and the Lord of, who is the kind of the bad guy at the end. Where the whole idea being that this object is so not just so powerful, but that very much that concept of ultimate power corrupts. And the concept is this can't survive safely, and so it must be destroyed. But it's so magical, the only place it can be destroyed is back where it was built.
Mm.
And the Lord of the Rings, the core, then follows along with some happy little lads who go against all odds to wander several hundred miles across a map to go and cast this ring into the initial fires in which it was forged to break it apart, whilst consistently going on around them is the like secondary and tertiary and just increasing knock-on effects of what happens when there is a world and a society that just gives so much power in so many different places, and there's just that constant corruption of all like, what if you could have this additional thing, and
Mm.
that temptation and how that can like deepen and darken various different folk. So that's the core of the story. There is obviously the prequel, essentially being the Hobbit, which stands alone, and when it was first actually released, wasn't intended to be directly like keyed into this
Mm.
wider story, but essentially tells the story of like how this object comes into the possession of Bilbo Baggins, the the eponymous Hobbit in this case. And then there's also so many additional material that's then been written and published. So obviously at the beginning you quoted the Silmarillion. There's also the Children of Húrin, if that's how to say it, and just so much of the stuff that it exists as a media, not even just a media empire. Although Warner Brothers are certainly happy to pull on as many different keychains as they can, but just as a significantly wider like story mythos, largely because of Tolkien's son, who just wanted to like codify this and get it out to everyone.
Mm.
It was born essentially from the stories that he would be told. Specifically, his dad, Rolkin Tolkien, would talk to him at night, tell him the stories of these things. And it is said that Christopher would be like, wait a minute, didn't you say this was going on? Didn't you say, well, I thought this was the case. And so at least a certain amount of the fact that it was written down into a book is largely to tell your own son to shut up, which, as a way of making any form of literature, I think is one that scores quite highly on the chain.
It does feel like Christopher Tolkien is the player at your table you don't want. When you've like set all this stuff up and now you've got something new and fancy and shiny to show, and they go, "Well, hang on a
Mm,
minute, that thing that you set up." and you hate that about them, and you hope that Harry Goodger never comes back to your table next Monday for the campaign.
Yeah, it's it's one of these like permanent, eternal feelings,
Yeah.
um, and without it, I don't think it's the thorn in the side that the pearl forms around. For it is the irritation that creates great beauty. In a word, a phrase that I just made up, but sounds as if I could have plucked it
It
from
was
Appendix
incredible.
3.
Yeah.
So
I'm actually going to listen to this episode, which will be the first one I've ever done that, and write that down and then
write it
say it was
down.
me. Yeah.
We should put it up on almost like when Inspirobot was taking random like stock images and random
Mm.
phrases and like mashing the two together. Um, should put it up on a. I remember when motivational posters were the way of the world. Uh,
Not anymore. Not anymore. They're just good props in movies.
yeah.
So our second question is, why did you choose The Lord of the Rings as the topic?
So it is a secret barely hidden that of all of the dungeons and all of the dragons that I'm a fan of, I'm a particular fan of the oldest versions.
Mm.
Last year I was playing, and the years before that I was playing quite a lot of original D&D, the stuff that was like released in 1974. If anyone got the exciting, huge, thick history of D&D book, the like big red covered one for Christmas, they may by now have got to the point where it goes through the draft of how the game existed before it existed,
Mm.
and so much of that essentially is like all of the Lake Geneva lads just pulling from the fact that it's like we really love these 7 books, and
Mm.
so we're just going to pull so much of that into this. But specifically, also, I think there's something of my generation that it's impossible to have a deep emotional resonance to this as a property, because it's, with the exception of Star Wars, which I think, because by the time I was coming into it, it was then the second visiting to it, but the
Mm.
biggest media touch point and the huge blockbusters were the Lord of the Rings films, right at
Mm.
the point where I was becoming an impressionable teenager. So I have that indelible mark that Strider has just kind of burned into my face there somewhere, and it's I've largely come to the conclusion that if you don't address these obsessions, then they will continue to fester. And and from the stories themselves, I've seen what effect that can have on evil kings. So I'm coming front and center on this and exploring it very much as an informed non-completionist.
Right.
Um, and I think because a lot of the time, because it's such a big story and a big book, um, there are thousands and thousands of pages just directly of the stuff that Tolkien had written that was published as this. Additional letters you can see when he's discussing what he thinks about this. And there is almost this fear that one must have consumed all of this stuff to be
Mm.
able to appropriately link in with this. And I'm using my medievalists training instead to go no, the amount at which you kind of intersect with it is all good and ready. And
Mm.
yeah, basically, you got this, even if you've only read some of the book, even if you've only read one of them, even if
Mm.
you haven't seen the films again in ages and don't know all of the memes.
I On that side note of seeing that franchise kind of bloom it into the theatrical films rather than the animated ones. Obviously that was
Mm.
99 I think to 2003, or is that that kind of year, that block of years. But I think at that time I would have been around 11 to 14,
Mm.
15, and it was, I guess you're just you're going into secondary school or high school if you're American, but so it might not be cool to go and see those things. Yet it felt like the entire world was very much into it. It was like the
Mm.
70s and 80s, you've always had fantasy in cinema, And you watch it as a kid, you don't understand that it's cheesy how it was made then, but at the time it wasn't cheesy, right? And then you watch The Lord of the Rings and you go, wow, this is on another level of how this is like how it looks, let alone the
Mm,
story itself. And so it does kind of like it captivates people to go and see it regardless of if you're into fantasy or not. I think that's clearly had
mm.
that if those movies hadn't been made, do you think it would be as popular today in the sense of people knowing what it is, games being made, and I don't mean Lord of the Rings itself as a franchise, like you said, Warner Brothers just kind of like churning out what it can from the IP, but the which we've seen in every sense, but like like D&D being inspired by obviously that came out 30, 40 years before those movies, but you know
Mm.
do you think Dungeons and Dragons would still be popular today if it wasn't for like, for instance, those movies coming out? You have that at the moment with Stranger Things, where a lot of people I've met
Mm.
over the years, if I ask them, my inspiration to play D&D was Lord of the Rings for many years. Then Stranger Things has come out, and most people, if like listeners on the podcast who are new to D&D or wanting to learn and get involved for the first time, they're usually Stranger Things fans who've come to.
Mm. Yeah,
So, do you think that's in the kind of zeitgeist that it's like a wave of it requires to be kind of remade?
I kind of think so. The main difference, I think, from a world that hadn't had the Lord of the Rings trilogy, like the Peter Jackson films at that point, um, is almost like I think that's at least within the wider scheme of like popular popular fictions and things that are like sufficiently like targeted at the mainstream,
Mm,
with respected actors who are going to draw people's attention in. Um, I don't think that there was a really solid, sincere fantasy, like extended fantasy film that wasn't being silly and acknowledging that it's silly.
mm.
I'm a huge fan of the first two Conan films, and they are excellent works of art with some phenomenal acting in there. You've got James Earl Jones in the first one. Um, you've got Mako. Um, I as a complete tangent, which feels fitting for a Tolkien episode. Um, I'm a fan of Magic: The Gathering, and they've recently released a set in the Avatar universe, being
Mm.
Avatar: The Last Airbender, rather than
The
those
blue
like
ones.
giant blue lads on Pandora.
Mm.
And I'd never watched the anime. My partner had seen it previously and was like watching it back while we were playing through the games.
Mm.
And there was like the voice that I was recognizing of Uncle Iroh. I'm like, I swear I know that guy, and then looked it up, and it's because he's the like wizard wise man in the first Conan movie, and it's like I've
Amazing.
been listening to this guy's voice for like 20 years.
Yeah.
But that film is silly, and it doesn't expect you to turn up to it and take it seriously and sincerely. Um, Whereas I think the Lord of the Rings films did, in a way that fantasy hadn't really done, science fiction had done for quite a while. Like a lot of
Mm.
I mean, Kubrick's quite impactful, I suppose, from like
Yeah.
2001, the film rather than the year, and especially a lot of like the horror elements in that point where you would just approach something for what it is and not be like, ha ha ha, isn't this silly? Now let's go and do this.
Mm.
And I think that was a significant touch point that basically like forked us into this version of reality where people were encouraged to take both fantasy stories effectively and literally. It certainly paved the way for like the outrageous success of the Game of Thrones,
Yeah.
the TV series, and it because there was a point even when I was in primary school / elementary school for those over the pond. I was a fan of fantasy stories.
Mm.
Quite a few of my friends were. It was very much one of those things that like boys were interested in.
Yeah.
But when I was teaching, a load of the other teachers that I was working with who grew up at the same time as me weren't a fan of fantasy when they were a kid. they would be talking about that they couldn't wait to watch the next episode of Game of Thrones. And
Yeah.
so people trusting, almost like not just immediately discounting. So people not just immediately discounting fantasy because it's childish could not have happened, in my opinion, without the Peter Jackson films.
Yeah.
And I think that has then provided like the big rung for more people to accept that, okay, Dungeons and Dragons is within that same wider field. And so I don't believe that there would be as many people are playing it today were it not for those films, even if it was people who don't have any personal connection to them, just because the whole of media has just shifted so much as a result of that. Frankly, if I can't imagine a version of Dungeons and Dragons where it hadn't been impacted. Most people now, if you think of elves, will think of tall, wafy, like nature lads, and that is, well, partially from Norse myth, but also almost exclusively from this series of books and the wider writings around them. If you look at any Celtic mythology, elves are essentially like weird little goblins and just strange other things. And so, yeah, the impact cannot be understated. Doubly so in terms of the games that we play.
Definitely. I mean, just to go off on another little tangent about elves, I immediately think of them as this tall, kind of wise nature folk. But if you do look at artwork for elves in any kind of fantasy, 70, from the 70s till those movies were made, they are almost like rogue figures. Like if they're kind of like, if they're dressed up, they're not in these like gorgeous silks and whatnot. They are almost they are closer to goblins, like in the way that people have painted them or illustrated them, and they are kind of like the thief class or the rogue, that kind of thing, which is quite odd because I feel like I've seen, obviously everything's kind of contextualized, but like I feel like I've seen images of an elf rogue from the 70s, and then I've definitely seen it in modern art as a goblin class, a goblin as a rogue class if you want to play it in a kind of compatible 5e book. And it's exactly the same kind of stance. It's the same clothing. Just is this guy's now green? Do you know what I mean? So I do think, I mean, everything's intertextualized, in general. It makes complete sense that like, wave after wave, people are inspired by something else that gets used here. But yeah, I guess going away from the movies then, it's mad that the Tolkien family, should we say, had so much kind of freedom to create without having to worry about moving on. Do you know what I mean? Some people will make their book, if it's not make or break immediately, then okay, right, well, I'm just going to write something else, or they won't write.
Yeah.
He's literally reading stories and then writing them down because his like Moni's son has made him do that, and then that's become a part of this other world. Or the Hobbit came first, right? But it does feel like it's kind of something Warner Bros. Would make them make because the movies were so good that they go, we need a prequel to this. A bit like they did with Harry Potter with those kind of like creature, the I haven't watched them, but the monster films after with Johnny Depp and stuff. They always like, oh, we need to know what he was doing before this happened. Or, Star Wars as a good example with prequels. It's so busy, it's so well fleshed out, people are loving it. What did he do before that? So let's make some money
Yeah.
that way. And it does feel like
Or
that,
even
but it's
still
weird.
seeing that.
Yeah.
Because you've got, even with Star Wars, like some of the most effective Star Wars things recently have been Andor, which is a prequel to a prequel to the
Yeah.
thing. So it's like before A New Hope, you've got Rogue One. Before that, you've got Andor. Ashoka, which again is a kind of like, it's not so much just prequel because a lot of the content from that, unless you're good at doing a deep dive and knowing what's going on with the other, like how these things link up. It's like, okay, well, this is story stuff that's kind of come off before. And I do think people have definitely got a like a desire to kind of look into. It's like, yeah, but what happened before that point? What about before this bit? Almost in a way of people wanting to sort of justify the like underlying like mythology and provenance. And like Tolkien specifically had said about Lord of the Rings, not about Star Wars, that it was his attempt almost to create this sort of enduring myth for England. Because so you've got these within Celtic cultures, you can look back, you've got stories like the Mabinogion, you've got all sorts of things from like Scottish oral poetry. England doesn't really have that because it's a mismatch of so many different like Germanic tribes. Germany and Scandinavia do have these like ancient myths of like Siegfried or Sigurd, depending on which version you've got. England never really had that. And so Tolkien almost in this way is trying to write this story as if it could be a mythology that underpins English values. And so I certainly think that's still like impacting why it was important then to be written, at least to him, and almost in a certain sense why it's got such an enduring resonance now, because people are constantly like, yes, but what had led to this? What had led to us?
Yeah, I also, I mean, once again, it's kind of like just throwing the idea in there, but everything kind of everything you seem to read or watch these days is set midway through a history of the world that we're thrown into, right? But I mean, from the get-go, we're in the third age. This isn't the first or second. The Silmarillion shows us how things are created, as I quoted at the beginning, how things begin. But our key story, whether it was The Hobbit or the trilogy that comes after, is what 3,000 years, maybe more. I think actually, I can't remember how long the third age actually lasts for, but I think it is 1,000 years. Um, but it's interesting that from the get-go he's doing that, and then people are, I'm assuming, are inspired by the idea that, well, if we set this up, then there's something to like kind of pull away from that they don't necessarily need to know, but they've got more to draw from down the line as to why these people are here, what makes the sacrifice so big.
Yeah, I think also as well as that, it makes it feel sufficiently real in that there is this like wider continuity and just like weight of history to the whole concept. And I think it's something that is very different in Europe compared to places in like in the New World. As in the New World, it's me in the 1960s, in the 1600s. In the fact that like you always see this wonderful excitement whenever there's like D&D in a castle, come and do this thing. And I used to play in the ruins of a castle as a child, because just out on like up the road from various villages all around East Anglia, you've just got stuff that just has been abandoned for
Yeah.
hundreds of years. And I certainly think that it's this idea that you've got that we're not the first, and that we're not doing things through like an extended it's not like this world has been set up for us and we're now expanding and exploring and doing what we're going to do. It's very much that we live within the wider history that we have here. And it also it keys in with the famous like screenwriter's advice of like arrive late, leave early, in that stories are really good if we don't have those. Like, you don't need to start at the very beginning for it to be really effective. You can just say there was a long history of things, but we're starting here.
Yeah.
And then it kind of like it grounds you in knowing that this is important somehow, because otherwise there wouldn't have been this history before. But that you don't have to be a historian to actively look into it.
It gives a bigger sense of the world that you're in, as right. So, I mean, going back to using it in D&D terms, if you're set, you don't usually set people up in a world that's happening there and then, as you just said, kind of arrive late, leave early. But the world feels bigger because things have already happened and you're just trying to kind of thrown into the chaos of it all.
There's also from a dungeon mastery perspective a significant benefit to that, which is that if you've got an off screen and you suddenly need to either fix things or add additional things, you're like, oh, but I've never established that we've got like tunneling dwarves here. Oh, they were just off the edge of the map and they've come in now. I mean, even if you look at the maps in the front cover of like the Lord of the Rings editions, there's like both like seas that extend off elsewhere, but there's also like land masses that we just don't see beyond. It's like, okay, well, we know that we've got like Easterlings coming from over here. We don't see what that involves. And you have all this potential by having there being like a map that feels big enough, and it isn't just you're looking entirely at the outside. Here's the entirety of the world. It's more that we're zoomed in enough that there is space to bring extra stuff in when it needs to, but also that it feels like all of these are like different cogs of the same machine.
So, like, bring that back to D&D itself. Like, if we're looking at that now more so than Lord of the Rings, how has Lord of the Rings inspired what we see in, I guess, all of the editions of D&D? So, like, a good example is we know of like creatures. A lot of what we see in D&D will be creatures directly taken from the books or the movies or whatever else comes out, and they go, that's a great idea, we'll change the name of that and look a bit different, we'll put a stat block on it. But that's with everything, right? That's the case of everything, that if it works as a good IP and people might know of it, people will likely put it in their own game, or it's great that you know a game developer will put that in for you in some sort of way. We've got classes like that too. So the great one people always reference is the Ranger class, essentially being Aragon, but mechanically it doesn't work as well as Aragon works or whatnot. Is there anything like that D&D clearly takes from Lord of the Rings?
I think it's gotten a lot better at hiding it now, but in the very first edition, before there was a first edition in the like original Dungeons and Dragons, one of the monsters listed is the Balrog.
Right.
Until the Tolkien estate come along and be like, no, you owe us money if you use that. And it's the same with although the word hobbit isn't printed in the same way in that book. Halflings are just what is a non-proprietary name that we can use for this group of people. You even have, again, in the very early rules, like hobbits have deadly accuracy with ranged weapons, specifically because of things that you've seen in those films.
Yeah.
Or I suppose at the time that hadn't seen in those films, but had seen in the fiction. So there's, right from the outset, like direct references to certain types of things. But you then also have this like wider concept of the way in which certain creatures and like classes of creatures pull on either the exact same imagery. So if you look at either like Celtic mythology or even to some extent like Norse mythology, goblins, horrible little bastards. But
If you are a goblin, I'm sorry for what he's just said.
Yeah, I mean, I personally love the bastardry, but it is it's the way in which this was expressed historically. And I think the thing with that is there's very little like organization and so on that you see. You might have like a small tribe or a group of this, but further to the Lord of the Rings, you have like armies of goblins and specifically of orcs, and the similarities and differences between them being pulled from this sense of seeing, so okay, well, we've seen how this like group of people can act. The ring wraiths in the films, in the books, and even to some extent the strange entities upon which they ride, whether or not it's like the horses or the fell beasts, all of this then kind of like just like seeps in and either directly influences certain types of like monster, or the visuals of them kind of like build up and impact a lot of other, like so much undead and the emotional feelings we get around them. And to some extent, I wouldn't be surprised even if it's the life draining powers. Like you've got undead like the White, where if it hits you, it reduces your maximum hit points. And almost the sort of thing where, like, you've seen the scene where, like, Frodo gets stabbed and impacted and things, and he's like physically wasting away as a result of these impacts, like these attacks. And so all of these things are directly, even if they're not a conscious reference to, but they are hugely influenced the way in which then the play is going to come around, the way the sort of expectations people have, because so much of the like natural storytelling experience we have, if we're sat around a table explaining things to each other, if someone describes like a cowled figure comes in and it's intensely cold and there's just this sound, most players think, it's probably going to drain our life because of the shared understanding of what we've got from the stories that we've read.
Yeah. So using that as an example, like with obviously MacGuffins, the idea of using kind of an item to like lead us on the story, take us somewhere in the end. The ring is that, right? The ring is a MacGuffin. Now, obviously, stories have existed way before Lord of the Rings, but do you think in kind of like modern popular culture that the ring is a key importance to what people like draw from for when they're writing their own stories, especially with D&D, where it might be just a case of, oh, on this quest you need to send this to this thing, and it could be literally be like taking a sword to a blacksmith somewhere. But do you think these kind of things have that, as you were just saying then, like you might not have done it on purpose, but you are thinking of it when you're, it's kind of like in the background of your mind. It's unconscious, like subconscious.
It's impossible to avoid at a certain point. You either, if you include any sort of like magical object on a trek, either you have to like acknowledge, or here is the huge example of where we've got these things, but also you've kind of got to, like, if you're not accepting and kind of taking part of that, you're having to make a direct conscious like stance against that thing. And so I think it's like gravitational pull almost is so significant you can't really avoid it. But I certainly think there's like multiple different ways in which this tends to come up in play as well. It either tends to be, and it's from a perspective of who's the protagonist essentially. So in The Lord of the Rings, from the outset, well, from chapter 2, Frodo has the ring. And the story is about him taking that object and putting it in a bin. But from the perspective of all of his antagonists, there's a guy with the thing we need. Let us go and get it. And so just at a very core basis, it provides so much opportunity for like heroic play, but also for quite flexible gameplay perspectives, because if you've got a thing that you need to protect, then that changes how you interact in situations. It's like in the section where they rock up in the prancing pony and have to remain secret, because if people understand and hear the name of what's going on, it's going to reveal what certain things that have happened. Despite the fact that, and you don't massively see this in the films compared to in the book. So in the book, Merry is much more of a sort of like gentleman about town. He's almost like Mr. Darcy from Pride and Prejudice, where everybody kind of recognizes him and what he says has a certain amount of importance. And like he goes to Bree a lot, but by having to turn up and be like, no, we need to keep our identity secret here. That then changes how you do things. And it seems like Strider personally has taken that quite significantly to heart as well. But you have this whole sense of, if you have an object that everyone is looking for, it makes for such easy gameplay because you've got really simple motivations of everybody wants this thing and they can't get it, coupled with just the sheer bad luck that can kind of come alongside that. Or you can easily flip it around with being like, right, there's this object that's being transmitted across this place and we need to get this thing. But my favorite thing, and I think that should be added to many more dungeon masters should do this, is to give their level 1 party an artifact level item from the beginning. It's like, cool, here you go. You've now got a 9 life stealer. Good luck.
Yeah.
And then it's just this whole idea. It's like, why, almost like the moralization of like, why am I the one responsible for carrying this thing that is storied way more than I am? And yeah, that's just the kind of like distress that I think we should be putting in the feet of our players more often.
There needs to feel like, other than just in combat, that you could lose your life, but from the get-go, outside of that, while you're actually there, there's a much bigger thing, bigger risk in like the choices you make, with what you've got, I suppose. Let me get to our next question, which is, how can DMs use the story better how can DMs use the story to better their own tales? Now, I've got a little quote here I'll read out from The Two Towers, which is one of my favorite pieces, and I was looking forever on the internet to make sure this was exactly correct. Um, a long tilted valley, a deep gulf of shadow, ran back far into the mountains. Upon the further side, some way within the valley's arms, high on a rocky seat upon Ethel Duath, stood the walls and towers of Minas Morgul. All was dark about it, earth and sky, but it was lit with a light. Not the imprisoned moonlight welling through the marble walls of Minas Ithil long ago, fair and radiant in the hollow of the hills. Paler indeed than the moon ailing in some slow eclipse was the light of it now, wavering and blowing like a noisome exhalation of decay, a corpse light, a light that illuminated nothing. So the idea of that, why I've quoted that, is players and DMs alike, more so DMs, but players not really giving too much description when they're doing things, or when the DM kind of goes, "What do you want? What do you see here?" When they give them the example. I've always thought that was a brilliant example from the book of immediately when I read the books before I'd seen the films as a kid, and like I immediately when I then saw it at the cinema was like, wow, because it felt there's almost no description in the film. You just see this big green kind of light come up across Minas Morgul, but you knew exactly what it was just from the staircase, the actual sheer rock face they're on. You know where they're going beforehand. It's such a beautiful description. And kind of where I was going with the question was like, you don't need that amount, you don't need that kind of rely heavily that much on prose or description of something so simple, right? But a lot of DMs can learn from reading these books or watching pieces and not necessarily, I mean, you can take from it, why not take from it? But using it to describe the world in a better way to really set up a presence as to why people are in this location rather than it's scary, that's where the bad guy lives. Really kind of giving into it. I think sometimes it is okay to kind of go over the top as to why this is more important than the last bad guy's castle you were at. You know, um, what do you think about that? Is that something that people can take from Lord of the Rings?
Yeah, certainly. And I think it's if you're using almost this like melodrama quite sparingly, it doesn't feel silly. And it almost like it's the one thing from the extract that you read, it's not just 1 or 2 sentences and then it's like, oh, this was a scary place. But continuing it enough, and it's just like every single additional thing is adding to it and intensifying just how like uncomfortable a location it is. The part that really stands out to me in that quote especially is that there is a light and you're like, okay, I know what light on a tower looks like. And go, oh, maybe it's moonlight or sunlight. And it's like, it's not that. Instead it's got this feel and this vibe.
It's magical light. It's magical light, like magical darkness. Yeah. When they say
exactly,
I've got light vision, I've got dark vision. Oh, it's magical light.
It's like, but not for this one for reasons. And so where you have that and just kind of keep going through and expanding and making it seem bigger. That section also really specifically reminds me of, there's a part early-ish in the poem of Beowulf where it describes the pool that leads to Grendel's cave. And it describes this just like foul part of like foul part of this swamp where like the water is so horrible that if a deer was being chased, it would rather stand on the thing and be like savaged than jump into the water.
Mm.
And then at the end of this description, it just says, that is not a good place. And almost this, it's like if you're telling something that sounds like it's so over the top it could be a joke, but it's just being delivered with this like cold precision. It's something that really helps. And actually, that's one of the main things that I think both a lot of beginner DMs and also people who've been playing for a long period of time, it's quite easy to fall into like rote patterns and being there is a way in which I regularly describe these things. And often that's perfectly fine and effective. Like the most important step is that we're saying these words so that everyone has kind of got the same shared mental vision of this,
Yeah.
the location that we're at. But by making something that's a little bit more like expanded than that or stands alone separately as well, it then its difference is kind of what draws even more attention to it. People are like, oh, there's something up about here because it stands out.
Mm.
And it isn't there's this wider concept. The direct phrasing of it, I think, is mostly attributed to Picasso. But Austin Kleon has done a great book about this called Steal Like an Artist, where the idea is that you're stealing concepts specifically with the intent of like reusing it and pulling it out there. And often, I mean, in the moment, you're probably not going to put little footnotes and say it's like, see the Two Towers, chapter 4.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you are, I mean, a load of other people around the table have read the same books or seen the same film. So often, if you're describing something and it's like, we both know this is close enough to this thing, it's then going to enable them to kind of like tap into their own like emotions and memories linked to that too. And I think thinking specifically about what am I seeing, what parts of this really appeal, and spending that like secondary step beyond just enjoying what's in front of you is probably the most useful thing so that you can then replicate it. Humans are very bad at copying. And even if you try and do a perfect copy, you're going to mess up somehow. And that is where those cracks are where the creativity gets it. But you need to have stopped and like smelled the flowers to kind of go, I can almost like notice how like it smells almost papery at this point because of how the pollen is or something. And secondly, the other part I think that works really well and that the Lord of the Rings is a really good example for is you should go on more walks. Not only because it's good for your general health, but also there's a certain thing that you just experience by walking. And if you're looking at the environment around you and how both like the space in which you're moving through interacts and like the way in which you hear certain things, like I'm currently living like on the coast. And so we've got all of these like woodland paths on like sheer cliff faces right next to the sea. And it's the sort of thing where if you take a zoomed in enough picture, it looks like it could have come straight from Lord of the Rings. If you zoom out, you see all the like really bad 1960s houses, and they're just like susurration of grey everywhere. But the process of going through, like enjoying walks, doing things like that, like the description, like the strength of the descriptions you can give, by tapping into these other things, like. Once you know how your ankles feel after you've been walking up a hill for 20 minutes, you can then just mention that offhand, and it's just helping your players immerse themselves much more in the world you're doing. And again, you're following that same sort of creative practice that Tolkien himself did. I mean, he would regularly go on walks with C.S. Lewis, and like they'd chat about things, and they'd functionally do like they'd echo off each other with their various like mutual world building. But it's good for both your health and your game's health. So yeah, walk
Very
more.
much so. There is actually I've got it here, but I tried to find it earlier, but I don't know where we've put it. But actually, it was recently that I purchased it. I'll put it in the show notes, but it is a book by a guy who has taken photos or taken illustrations or even photos that Tolkien had of places that he walked for his inspiration. across the
Mm,
UK. And then this book is gorgeously illustrated as well as having those kind of attachments, inside. Um,
mm.
it's really nice. I'll put it in the show notes. I'm gutted I can't because I was looking for it before the episode just in case that came up. So it's funny that you brought it up naturally and then. But it's really good. And I was listening to an episode of The Rest is History, which I absolutely
Mm,
love that podcast. And they talked about Tolkien a couple of months back, or specifically The Hobbit, and they recommended that book. And then reading it is actually, it is amazing, and it is actually very inspiring for your D&D. Especially, I guess it's easier as an English audience than an audience who's never been to the UK and doesn't understand the
mm.
geography. But it's very easy to go, oh wow, I've seen this before, or oh
Yeah.
wow, I can get that because I know somewhere like that near where I live. And then you take that, and then like you said, people at your table have probably read it before. In that instance, they've been somewhere like that before, so they have the same experience to draw from, regardless of if it was exactly the place.
Mm. But I think even beyond that, like even if you haven't grown up in England, um, and you've been blessed by life in not having to be in this wonderful country, um, but you can do the same thing wherever you live,
Yeah.
of walking around looking at the specific, like, just habits of nature close to you. Like there's some really good content that is either like Southern Gothic, like based out of like the Southern American states, like Louisiana regions,
Mm.
and the vibes that you get from that, from seeing people describe it. There's some really good content coming out from Southeast Asia where people are both talking about like the way in which people interact with the sea. Like the sea in England, we're one big island, and if there's the ocean there, it's like, well, no, that's a stop. Whereas instead, it's the ocean is like it's a road that you can use to get between other sections, and
Mm.
here are the way in which you interact with the plants and the signs that you see. Um, it's especially fascinating because I've always grown up near the coast. Um, I've lived in cities much more recently. Um, my partner has always lived in cities, specifically the big one. And now that we're at the coast and they're seeing certain things of the sea, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's this. And it's just because I've spent so long living by the coast and just spotting the normal signs of what
Mm.
things usually look like. Um, and every single person has got personal memories that they can pull out and seed into things. It doesn't have to be. It itself doesn't have to be epic. And I think that's probably one thing that, like, being a Brit and looking at the influence of Lord of the Rings, I mean, like, I've walked down along a country road like this before, but here is the way in which then Tolkien took it and turned it into something terrifying, because it's like, okay, well, I've seen the way in which tree roots stick up out of the ground and like badger sets underneath kind of like collapsed, and I could imagine how it would be to be in that section.
Mm.
And it's in taking that thing that is very real and has this like inbuilt emotional impact with you, and then presenting it in a way that it enables it to be fantastic or heroic, um, or horrific.
I've got one last question here, but I'm sure we can continue going if there's other pieces. But if you had to select one piece of the franchise to be your favorite, what would it be and why? But I guess more so, is there anything from, the franchise itself that has inspired your way of playing D&D, or how you've DM'd D&D? I guess TTRPGs in general, but more
Mm,
so obviously being a D&D podcast, is there anything where you go, oh, that's from this and that's a great use. I could use that here.
mm. So the biggest single thing, actually, my first introduction to Lord of the Rings, um, when I was younger, I became obsessed with game books, an obsession that I retain to this day. And even before the films came out, I would pick up all game books I would find, um, and I think there's a selection of four of them, although I only ever had two, that were Middle Earth Quest,
Mm.
and they were four game books set alongside the story, And the two that I had was A Spy in Isengard and um, Treason at Helm's Deep. And both of these take place in these iconic locations that I would soon come to know and recognize from watching the films and then from going and reading the books. And the fact that they were just adjacent to this other part and also were very much based in the physicality of the location. I mean, one of the things that's just so fascinating about both of them, and certainly I've stolen this sense of scale for pretty much every game that I've run, is just like Orthanc is enormously huge. You just have like the physical aspects of it and the sort of like the wider, almost like hub and spoke design of the sort of like extended castle grounds around it. And then from having wandered around it as like a little protagonist in a game book and have just seen all of these, almost like the perspective of seeing it at one person scale compared to everything else. Because one thing that is quite obvious from the fiction is just the sheer weight of people there.
Yeah.
Or the sheer like architectural scale. But then also insisting on, and I think the main thing that I've sort of drawn from that is insisting that I'm imagining it as one person on the ground from their eyes, rather than like looking over. Like, it's phenomenal once you like look to the east on the dawn of the third day, and then Gandalf comes over the hill. Like, seeing the whole spectacle of this huge fight is amazing, but also just imagining that you're there and there's just like countless people beside you, even more so like in front, and just seeing this at this just like very, very personal scale. And I think that's something that I consistently aim to bring into the games that I run. And I think partially for me as well, it's because that contrast between I am one small person and I'm fairly tall, I'm not especially light, but then just the world around is so vast. And the contrast between that is just really compelling.
It's really easy. It's interesting to say because it's really easy that as the DM to give a general, when it comes to like a map, or like, oh, you're describing a town quickly, you are giving an overview of it. So everything is quite small because it's an overview. And then it's like playing Civ, like, oh, this is here and this is there. You give a little bit of description of that one thing there, but you're quickly getting through everything. And then you get to a tavern and you describe the tavern really in depth, and you're like, okay, but it doesn't feel big because I understand what a tavern could look like already. You just kind of if anything, even if you're over describing or not describing much at all, what you are describing just feels like they're points of interest because I know what a tavern feels like. Whereas if you are doing it from the ground level in like Orthanc as an example, well then as a DM and you're describing that, you're giving them a visual reference as to exactly what they see rather than as an overview, right? This is what you can see in your periphery right now because it's so big and there's this, and that. You're not going to give them something that's 40 minutes walk away because how would they know that yet when they've just turned up at the town gate?
And because I think, again, that's another benefit of going places and seeing them with your own eyes. It's just like looking at just how tall trees are, and like you see it with, there are certain things that your brain can't recognize the true size of until you've seen it. And I think one version of this is like the Mona Lisa. Incredible painting, wonderful piece of historic art, and so on, slightly ruined by the fact that everyone would rather take their own photograph of it rather than any of the very high quality scans that exist, just to prove I saw this thing. It's tiny. It's not quite as small as a car or something. It's so miniature.
It is, and directly opposite, and I wish I knew the name of the painting, is absolutely incredible. Like, probably my favorite piece in that same room as the Mona Lisa. I recommend people Googling the painting in the same room as Mona Lisa because there's only two, the Mona Lisa and this other painting. But it's like it's like a 60-foot wide piece, and it is incredible. And the Mona Lisa, when I went there to see it, I took a photo of the 300 people
Of the
taking a
crowds,
photo.
yeah.
I didn't bother even attempting. I wasn't bothered. I was more impressed by like what the thrill of people queuing up to do it, you know.
Mm,
But sorry, yeah,
yeah,
going off
yeah,
on the
just
tangent, I just that's something that's always stuck with me after seeing it. I was like, wow, this is like, not the same,
it's
not
just
cool.
yeah. But even then, like something like St Paul's Cathedral in London, you're like, oh, it's a big church, um, and then you turn up and see it, and it's huge. Like
Mm,
it is vast. Like the door to get in is like 4 times my height, if not more.
yeah.
Um, and just seeing certain things in such a scale is, I think, really important both for like monumentalism, like when people want to build something so it looks impressive,
Mm,
um, but also for kind of like weird sense of myth in that certain things are big because they've either been important or because they've been inhabited by people who are just significantly larger than we are.
mm,
We are but a tiny speck, and yet, despite that, we must strive to do what is correct and
mm.
right. If that's the main message that I've taken from Lord of the Rings, is that even if it breaks us, that we should strive to do what's correct. Um, and get a man who cares far too much about a vegetable that wouldn't have existed in Middle Earth to carry us up the wall.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, if you have anything else to add, otherwise I think we will leave it there. I think it's actually been a really, really nice episode. I've been too kind. I've been too kind. Um, that's what
I
that's
think the final thing I would want to add is that because of the sheer impact of the Lord of the Rings, pretty much every single fantasy artist that you could possibly be like, oh, I really love this artist, will have done at least 1 or 2 pictures directly drawing from stories from it.
mm,
Um, my favorite of which is when Eowyn is attacking the Witch King, drawn by Frank Frazetta. Frank Frazetta, mostly known for his like Conan style, over the top pulpy artwork. He's a big fan of bums. He cakes everybody up in all of his drawings. There's so many quotes of him saying it's like, I just love an ass. His version of that painting has no trousers on Eowyn, just a like chainmail top, which is then amusing because if you then take one additional step, she dressed that way to hide amongst the male
yeah, yeah.
soldiers. And so the implications that all of them were just going out in these like assless chaps
Just to make sure she
to
was
fight the
hidden.
hordes of orcs. And it's that second stage of world building that I think we need to lean more into.
Yeah, I actually thought you were going to say that the Witch King wasn't where it had like it was absolutely caked out. That's what I thought you were going with. So beautiful. Imagine that. That's why
Almost, but
people
to be
fear it.
fair, the standard Death Dealer art is hugely influenced by the visual identity of like the riders
Yeah,
at the beginning where we see the ring wraiths on the horses,
yeah,
and the Death Dealer is just this big, huge, chunky guy. Um, yeah, basically, there's a game not about this in general, but the focus is on this called Meatheads, which is kind of in product. There's a third party supplement for this game that's out, although Meatheads, this game proper, isn't out yet.
mm,
And it's a game where you have one stat, which is your strength, and it's all about just being big and buff and going on quests. And yeah, and I think that's probably would make it perfect. The
lovely.
perfect vibe for Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, that's what we need. Just more strength.
Swall Gandalf.
Okay, well, thank you very much for today. I'm going to lead us out with one last quote that I will well, one last citation. I don't know what you call it. I'm just going to say it, and poorly. Um, so, to Sam, the evening deepened to darkness as he stood at the haven, and as he looked at the grey sea, he saw only a shadow on the waters that was soon lost in the west. There still he stood far into the night, hearing only the sigh and murmur of the waves on the shores of Middle Earth, and the sound of them sank deep into his heart. Beside him stood Merry and Pippin, and they were silent. At last the three companions turned away, and never again looking back, they rode slowly homewards, and they spoke no word to one another until they came back to the Shire. But each had great comfort in his friends on the long grey road. At last they rode over the downs and took the east road, and then Merry and Pippin rode on to Buckland. And already they were singing again as they went. But Sam turned to Bywater, and so came back up the hill. As day was ending once more, and he went on, and there was yellow light, and fire within, and the evening meal was ready, and he was expected. And Rose drew him in, and set him in his chair, and put little Eleanor upon his lap. He drew a deep breath. Well, I'm back, he said. And as always, thank you for tuning in. And if you like joining on the D&D action, then please follow us on Instagram at How to Play D&D, or check out the link in our bio to join our Discord server. And check out Black Mark Clo on Instagram for cool D&D inspired clothing. Sean, what can we do? What do you do, and where can we find it?
So I'm a games designer and an editor, and you can find it in a variety of places. Most effectively by searching Sean F. Smith, whether that's on Medium, where I blog, or Itch, where I tend to release some products, or Instagram, where I go around mostly looking at beautiful people and horrific horror art in equal measure.
We'll put your links in the bio as always. So yeah, thank you so much. This is actually one of my favourite episodes because I absolutely love Lord of the Rings. I love someone who can really get into Lord of the Rings and make it work in the other thing I absolutely love, which is being sarcastic and not reading very well. I've been
the only appropriate way of being into fiction, I think.
It's that's what autism and ADHD does to you. I've been Connor Kinsey.
I've been Sean Smith.
Good day.